The Trump administration has continued its campaign of lethal strikes against suspected drug traffickers in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. To date, 83 people have reportedly been killed in 21 strikes. The strikes have met increasing scrutiny, both inside the United States and abroad, with some close U.S. allies reportedly suspending intelligence sharing over concerns of the illegality of the campaign. This is the Just Security podcast. I'm your co-host, Tess Bridgeman, co-editor-in-chief of Just Security and former deputy legal advisor to the National Security Council and associate White House counsel. I'm joined today by co-host Rachel Goldbrenner, executive director of the Reiss Center on Law and Security at NYU School of Law. Joining us to discuss the latest developments are Rebecca Ingber and Brian Finucane.
Rebecca is a professor at the Cardozo Law School. From 2021 to 2023, she was a counselor on international law in the Office of the Legal Advisor at the U.S. State Department, where she had previously served as an attorney advisor. She's written extensively on matters of presidential powers, international law, and security. Brian Finucane is senior advisor for the U.S. program at the International Crisis Group. Before that, he served for over a decade as an attorney advisor in the Office of the Legal Advisor at the U.S. State Department, where he advised the U.S. government on legal and policy issues regarding war powers and military force. Rebecca, Brian, and Tess are all senior fellows at the Reiss Center on Law and Security.
We've brought you 3 installments of this podcast and are here today to discuss some of the latest developments. First, the administration's actions continuing apace with now 21 reported strikes. We've also seen increasing pressure on Venezuela and on the Maduro government on the part of the Trump administration. We'll unpack some of the U.S.'s closest allies, suspending intelligence sharing with respect to these strikes. And we'll also talk more about what we know about the legal process inside the U.S. government to date, including a controversial and as yet unreleased memorandum from DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel purporting to authorize the campaign. We'll cover what's going on in Congress, including the War Powers Resolution's 60-day termination clock having run back on November 3rd, and we'll also discuss other developments in accountability and potential liability for these actions. Starting with what we know about the process inside the U.S. government, and in particular that OLC opinion that purports to justify this campaign as a whole, let's unpack what we know so far. And maybe I'll turn to you, Brian, to get us started. What is the administration's theory here, and what do we know about the OLC memo as compared to, say, some of the statements the administration has been offering from the podium or with respect to its briefings to Congress that have mostly happened behind closed doors?
Thanks, Tess. It's good to be with you today. Just to back up, for listeners who may not be aware, the Office of Legal Counsel within the Department of Justice functions as something like a Supreme Court within the U.S. executive branch. And their advice, unless overridden by the Attorney General or the U.S. President, is binding on the rest of the executive branch. And their advice, furthermore, can serve as a get-out-of-jail-free card, or at least has in the past, and it served that function most notoriously with respect to the torture program under the Bush administration. So there is reportedly an OLC opinion, variously described as dating either from July or potentially September of this year, that was composed to bless the lawfulness of these strikes. We have some additional reporting.
To pause you there briefly, Brian, just for folks' awareness, the government can often act on OLC's oral advice, which can then later get memorialized. It's possible here that there's a written opinion in July that's not finalized yet. It's possible that there's oral advice. Either way, we're hearing that there's probably a finalized opinion dated September 5th, but earlier advice rendered in July. Does that sound right?
That's right. And I think that there almost certainly was earlier advice in July. It was necessary to bless these strikes as lawful before they commenced, necessary to overcome any legal qualms that there may have been at the Department of Defense or the relevant combatant commands.
So the opinion itself, how would you describe what you've been hearing?
So it's described as being, 40 plus pages. There is a factual appendix attached to it describing the various, quote, designated terrorist organizations that the U.S. is using force against, now using force against, or at least authorized use force against by virtue of this opinion. And the question presented seems to be whether the president would have authority to use lethal force against vessels, unflagged vessels in international waters suspected of carrying drugs. And so the two principal issues that the opinion analyzes based on in public reporting and my own conversations are one, would the president have authority to use force unilaterally in the absence of congressional authorization? And here the opinion falls back on the well-established OLC framework, the two-pronged test, whether the use of force would advance a sufficiently important national interest, and then two, whether it would amount to war in the constitutional sense requiring congressional authorization. Now, on the first prong, the national interest prong, the opinion reportedly places great emphasis on the national interest of stopping the flow of narcotics that cause overdose deaths, addressing the death, violence, and destabilization caused by criminal groups, cartels in Latin America. Notes that lethal action seems to be required, or maybe the president has determined lethal action is required because non-lethal action was insufficient. And also reportedly and interestingly compares fentanyl to being a chemical weapon. Okay, and so the national interest prong of this test is not very constraining, and the administration managed to check that box. And the opinion also concludes that the strikes at sea on unflagged vessels in international waters would not amount to war by virtue of their nature, scope, and duration to require congressional authorization. Okay, that's sort of the less surprising part of the analysis and less controversial in some ways. The trickier question and the issue that the opinion had to address is why aren't these strikes murder? Okay, premeditated killing outside of armed conflict is generally regarded as murder and would appear to implicate various domestic criminal laws and offenses under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And there, the opinion concludes that the administration the U.S. government is involved in a non-international armed conflict with 24, quote, designated terrorist organizations, which are identified supposedly in the documents, but not publicly released. And there is a factual laydown in this appendix that places great weight on statements and previous conclusions by the White House itself. So the administration is generating its own facts upon which it reaches this legal conclusion. And it also reportedly places weight on hostilities between these groups, or at least some of these groups, and the countries in which they're located. So not that these groups are necessarily fighting the United States or not fighting the United States already, but that there may be, say, for example, drug cartels in Mexico that have been fighting the Mexican government. And then the memo further opines that the U.S. could use force in, quote, collective self-defense of these states, even if they have not requested intervention by the United States.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there, and you're not even done describing the memo, Brian, but maybe we can start getting at a couple of these points. One is, how is it possible that just because a couple of these groups, and you mentioned there are 24 listed, right? A couple of them might, under international law, qualify as an organized armed group, right? That means they have a command structure, capable of following orders, engaging in what looks like, paramilitary activity. So a couple of these groups might fit that description, maybe the ELN in Colombia, maybe a couple groups in Mexico, maybe a few others. Certainly not all 24, right? Certainly not TDA, as we've discussed before on this podcast, Tren de Aragua, operating primarily out of Venezuela, which was ostensibly the target of the first reported strike and some of the others. How do you get from some of these groups might qualify as organized armed groups and might be in intense enough hostilities within their home country to all 24 of these groups are fair targets? Do we know how they make that leap?
Well, reportedly, again, there's heavy emphasis placed on factual assertions and conclusions by the White House itself. And listeners may recall that the administration had previously invoked the Alien Enemies Act against Tren de Aragua and claimed that this group was conducting either an invasion or a predatory incursion against the United States. So it could be the case that they reached the conclusion that Tren de Aragua, for example, is an organized armed group relying on manufactured facts and manufactured factual conclusions from the White House, right?
What's interesting about that parallel or that connection, Brian, is, of course, in the context of the AEA litigation and in the context of that proclamation, they're trying to draw a connection to Venezuela specifically, right? There's some suggestion that Venezuela is, or the Venezuelan administration is directing these groups for the purposes of trying to invoke a statute that is clearly intended to cover foreign governments, right? Because the people who would be implicated under those statutes are supposed to be enemy nationals. They're supposed to be nationals of that foreign government. And yet, in the context of these boat strikes, the administration is claiming that these are non-state actors, and specifically said in at least one of these reports to Congress that these were non-state actors in a NIAC.
Yeah, I mean, there's inconsistencies and tension in the various legal positions this administration has staked out with respect to TDA and Venezuela generally. Part of that, I believe, is a function of, for many months, the administration wanted to have its cake and eat it too, demonize and characterize Venezuelan migrants as, an invading, army, as it were. But on the other hand, not wanting to completely rupture relations with Caracas because the administration still want to send deportees back to Venezuela. That dynamic may be shifting, but I think that is one of the things that's been at play here over the last several months.
But it would make it hard to argue collective self-defense, for example, of Venezuela, if they're simultaneously arguing that Venezuela is directing some of these actions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Or Colombia, for that matter, when Colombia is saying this is murder, right? So the collective self-defense claim clearly doesn't work, but you can see why they might want to draw that legal conclusion because it is a more plausible basis for the use of force, even though, as we need to emphasize over and over again, the facts simply don't fit. You don't get to draw a legal conclusion without facts to support it, which seems to be what they're doing here.
Right. If they had if they were limiting this to the specific groups that they're arguing are in fact organized armed groups engaged in NIACs with their home countries, then the problem would be that those countries have not requested our assistance. But we don't even get there because the facts don't actually support this for the most part. It's certainly not across the 24 groups.
That's right. And you get the additional problem that the people on the boats are still not members of those armed groups. So far as we know, they're certainly not, engaging in hostilities at the time that they are likely ferrying probably cocaine from point A to point B for transshipment, probably to Europe, right? So kind of it fails at a number of levels, but you can see why they might have been tempted to try to take that path.
So this tees up another revelation that's been publicly reported by a few outlets about the analysis in the OLC opinion, which is that at least one category of the targets that were blessed as lawful by the opinion are the drugs themselves, under the theory that the drugs are, quote, war-sustaining objects under the law of war.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us, Brian? Should we be thinking of a parallel to, say, striking oil fields that were under ISIS control? What's the legal
poppy fields in Afghanistan?
Exactly. Those are the relevant recent precedents, or potentially relevant. So the concept of a war-sustaining object is a gloss on Article 52.2 of the first initial protocols to the Geneva Conventions. The U.S. regards this to be customary international law, and it lays out the test for what constitutes a military objective. That is, an object that may be lawfully targeted. And I'll just read it to you so you, for the sake of accuracy. Insofar as objects are concerned, military objectives are limited to those objects which by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization in the circumstances ruled at the time offers a definite military advantage.
Okay. And that's what the black letter law basically on the definition of a military objective. That definition is pretty well settled and not controversial. So how do we get to these war-sustaining objects and drugs being war-sustaining objects from there? And
to back up, we have to be in an armed conflict to even be having that conversation, right?
Right, exactly right, and that really is going to be the threshold problem with much of this theory writ large, but particularly this theory for targeting. So is black letter law recognized as such by the U.S. government as constituting customary international law and regarded as such by most states, even if they're not party to this treaty. So the theory about war-sustaining objects is that some objects, because they generate revenue or finance the military action of an enemy force, and their destruction can offer a definite military advantage, they can fit the standard for Article 52 on that basis alone. Okay. And the recent examples of that have been oil facilities under the control of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And so it was on this basis that the US, Russia, France, and Britain all conducted airstrikes against those petroleum facilities. So it's like 4 of the 5 P5. This theory, I should say, is not universally accepted. There have been a number of academic criticisms of it. And one of the basis for the criticism is the concern about blurring the line between military objectives, which may be lawfully attacked, and civilian objects, which may not be attacked, right? And how you draw those lines. Also, as Rebecca mentioned, this theory was used to justify strikes on drug labs and drug caches in Afghanistan. Okay, and on the theory that the proceeds from the sale of these drugs in Afghanistan was going to fund the insurgency against the U.S.-backed government and U.S. forces there.
So that's another one of the disconnects, that even assuming we're in the counterfactual world where the administration has said there's an armed conflict that doesn't exist, what hostilities would these drug sales be facilitating, right? There's certainly no hostilities with us, with the United States at all, right? To our point that we're not in an armed conflict. But what hostilities, say, is TDA engaged in anywhere, right? That the proceeds from cocaine sales would qualify as war sustaining rather than just, sustaining the activities of this gang, this criminal organization. So they're both kind of making the leap that we're in an armed conflict at all, which has no factual basis. But there's a second leap, right? That selling drugs is, for most of these groups that aren't in fact organized armed groups and aren't in fact engaged in hostilities in their home countries, are somehow financing some form of military-like violence, right? That looks like an armed conflict.
Yeah, it seems like they've taken this theory that you've discussed, which is controversial, but let's just take it as, let's assume that it is a black letter law, right? That once you're engaged in an armed conflict, and with an actor that has, in the case of Al-Qaeda, in the case of ISIS, has actually engaged in armed attacks to which these states are responding, right? So they're then engaged in an armed conflict, and then they have decided to target these objectives, which are perhaps controversial under LOAC, but let's assume that for the sake of argument here, that this is acceptable. In this case,
armed conflict that applies during war.
Right. So in this case, we've got these organizations that I think it is self-evident that these are organizations that are involved in the sale of drugs. These are not organizations that have engaged in an armed attack on the United States. They haven't engaged in an armed attack on, there's no one else in our coalition that is using force against them at this point. So we don't even have the multinational scenario that we had with respect to fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So we've got these groups that are engaged in drug smuggling, let's say, and perhaps at times they engage in acts of violence as part of their efforts to smuggle and sell drugs. The administration is taking this scenario and flipping it on its head and saying, actually, the entire purpose of these organizations is acts of war, acts of terrorism, armed attacks. We don't have any armed attacks, but we're just going to say that that's what they've engaged in. And then we're going to say that all of the drug smuggling that we know is in fact the purpose for these groups is actually for the purposes of fueling their acts of terrorism. And so that's how we back our way into an analog to the ISIS oil fields.
And before we move on to some of the related topics, I just did want to ask, we're spending time parsing what we think is the legal theory being advanced to support these actions. We're talking about the ways in which some of the justifications may be contradictory, but of course, without the underlying document that has been described in conversations, in news reports, shown perhaps to some members of Congress, but not to the public. So can any of you comment on how unusual that is, and what are the hopes that the layperson might be able to see this OLC memo? What is incumbent upon the administration to do in terms of transparency when it's undertaking, actions of this magnitude, in terms of advancing the justification in a legal sense for its actions?
Yeah, well, certainly, and Beck and Brian weigh in here too. Certainly, it's not unprecedented for OLC to lack transparency. That said, in some of the most controversial strikes taken in the past, especially ones that are not ones in which there's congressional authorization and ones that seem to be a significant departure from past practice, there have been memos released. The Libya opinion, the Syria chemical weapons strikes opinions in 2017-18 timeframe. And we've also seen here, it is unlikely that this opinion will stay shrouded in secrecy forever. Now, certainly it can be redacted to remove any classified information. Certainly there are ways in which national security professionals, right, will screen it before it's just released to the public. But it is very likely that either by freedom of information request, right, by congressional disclosure or otherwise, this document will eventually be public. I think it's important to recognize, though, and this is, right, Brian, your phrase, it's going to be a version of legal Mad Libs no matter what. It's absurd, this legal argument that we've been trying to wrap our arms around here on its face. And the reason we care is because it's important to know how the government is purporting to justify its actions. It's important to know, what legal advice operators were relying on. But we're not going to have some sort of aha moment when this memo is eventually released in whatever declassified form that makes us think, oh, right, of course, this all makes sense now. This campaign is perfectly above board. Maybe there's questions at the margins with how it's being carried out, right? So yes, it's important that we see a declassified version of this memo, right? Yes, it's important that the executive branch be held to account for what it's put on paper that purports to justify this campaign. But we shouldn't take our eye off the ball that this memo isn't going to all of a sudden make us understand in some way that we don't right now that all of this is legally permissible or somehow above board in a new way.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'll just add two small points to this, which is one, this highlights why it is so important that we see these memos in real time, and we often don't. I agree with Tess entirely that this will likely eventually come out. But in the meantime, there's this belief in the public and there's this focus. It creates a focus on the Hill that if only they could see this secret OLC memo, well, then it would all become clear, and that's the real problem. The real problem is the lack of information. And no, there is no legal analysis that is going to fit this square peg into this round hole. This is always going to be murder. But the lack of transparency creates this fog, I think, for the public and the press and the Hill. That's in some ways a distraction. And so I think it's important to unpack exactly what is likely to be in there to sort of demystify it to some extent. There's one more reason why it will, in fact, be important as a practical matter, and that is because, as many people have discussed, I don't think that the memo provides per se immunity for the people who are acting on it, but it does mean that anyone who's acting on reliance on the memo and within its bounds, we're unlikely to see a future prosecution for a number of reasons, in particular that the person had reason to think that they might be acting lawfully. And so that would make prosecution very difficult. And so if we know precisely what are the metes and bounds of that memo, that will give us a better understanding of what actions, like, for example, the actions of over the week that we learned about over the weekend, might be outside it.
I should add one asterisk to that, because I think Beck is exactly right. That courts have been willing to say, and the executive branch internally has said, right, acting on OLC advice, there's a presumption that you're exercising legitimate governmental authority. That presumption itself is one that is starting to erode. And I would recommend to you the work of Ryan Goodman et al. On just security, looking at all the ways in which the court is starting to reject or at least question reliance on the Department of Justice assertions made in court because they simply aren't holding up. They're simply not factual. And so I do think it's important not to think of this memo as a get out of jail free card, even though those within the executive branch who requested it certainly probably do view it in that light. But Rachel, you were about to say we should get into other aspects of what's going on in Congress and with this campaign. Yes. Otherwise, let's try to turn to that.
Okay. Yes, there's no shortage of topics here. So, Beck, some of us have noticed and commented on the fact that there is a 60-day clock under the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And when the administration submitted a War Powers report, what's called a 48-hour report on September 4th for the strikes that it took on September 2nd, it started that clock because it was reporting activities that were categorized we would think as hostilities, and that there are consequences after the 60-day clock has tolled. So can you describe for us what is the significance of that law and that provision, whether the administration would agree with that interpretation, and then also talk about any past precedents that you think are relevant to this question?
Yeah, so I want to back up for a moment and just explain the clock and explain what it does and does not do. So I think it's so in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in an effort to try to reset the balance between the president and Congress over decisions to use force, because the Constitution, as we all know, gives that power to Congress. Congress has the power to declare war, but the president had been increasingly using force unilaterally without congressional approval, and in the wake of Vietnam, in particular, Congress said, "Okay, we're actually going to get it together, get over our collective action problems, and pass this legislation to try to reset that balance." One of the things they did in that legislation was try to define when the president has the unilateral authority to use force at all, and Congress said pretty clearly that the president has the power to use force basically when responding to a national emergency caused by an attack on the United States. Otherwise, the president can use force in conjunction with a declaration of war or an AUMF, a congressional statute authorizing force. When the president is using force unilaterally under that very narrowly defined area of using force in response to an actual attack on the country, the Congress put an additional constraint and said, okay, you can use force for 60 days, perhaps 90 days if you get a waiver. And after that point, you have to stop unless we've authorized force. So it's basically giving Congress the opportunity to have a little bit of time in order to get its act together and weigh in. That 60-day clock is an additional constraint. If the president didn't have the authority to use force to begin with, the 60-day clock doesn't give him that force. It's just imposing an additional constraint on his ability to do so. In this case,
have two different legal questions, right? One is the one that Brian was saying the OLC memo unpacks, right? Which is, was there authority under Article 2? That's what you're just referencing, Beck. It's a constitutional law question. Separately, there's the statute, the War Powers Resolution, that has a statutory legal question of is the military being used in hostilities? Has it been introduced into hostilities or imminent hostilities? And after 60 days, are those hostilities ongoing?
That's exactly right. And I should add that even though Congress laid out its theory of when the president can use force unilaterally in this statute, the president's theory of when the president can use force unilaterally is much more expansive. And through successive OLCs, the presidential lawyers have argued that and claimed, sort of staked out the power for the president to use force whenever the president is acting in the national interest and it's not war in the constitutional sense, by which they've defined as something that doesn't rise to the nature, scope, and duration of what is essentially, at this point, a ground invasion. So one way to look at this is, well, at least under those OLC precedents, this isn't a ground invasion. These one-off strikes or these strikes that have not involved the introduction of ground forces into a country perhaps would qualify as falling below that threshold. I think that we'd also have to add in here the fact that if these strikes are murder, which we on this podcast have said repeatedly that they are, it's actually in our title, that would weigh into the analysis of whether or not the president had that constitutional authority, and I think that it would weigh heavily against. But in any event, even if the president had the constitutional authority to be using force, to be engaged in hostilities for 60 days, at that 60-day mark, and this was November 3rd, Congress is saying that authority ceases. And at this point, you need to still get congressional authorization. Now, I suspected, and Just Security published a piece with me and Jess Thibodeau on this shortly before the expiration of the 60-day clock. I had a feeling that the administration would say nothing and would let this milestone go without comment. But in fact, they weighed in and they said, actually, we don't need to stop because we're not engaged in hostilities. And that statement is belied by the fact that they've stated repeatedly that they're engaged in a NIAC, the fact that they're using force repeatedly against individuals and killing people, the fact that they had sent Congress the initial 48 hours report, presumably on the theory that they were engaged in hostilities and had to do so. And so it didn't hold water. But there is some precedent for administrations making this argument, and most notably in 2011 in Libya, when U.S. forces were operating then as part of a multinational coalition under a UN Security Council resolution. So in that case, there was international law justification for the acts, and it was part of a multinational coalition to protect civilians under threat from the then leader of that country, Gaddafi. Obama didn't pull forces back at the 60-day mark and in fact continued on for several months. And when Congress raised concerns with this, the president sent the legal advisor of the State Department, then Harold Koh, to Congress to testify and explain that because the administration had backed off of its initial actions, because it was taking a different role in the coalition forces, et cetera, that the use of force no longer constituted hostilities for the purpose of the War Powers Resolution. Now, this was broadly criticized. It was criticized by members of Congress. It was criticized by academics and others in the aftermath. And it is, I think, while I don't think that argument held water, I think it is nevertheless a different argument than the one we're seeing today, where there has been no drawing back. In fact, the president has quite clearly said that these attacks are going to continue and perhaps might even escalate.
Well, and when you look at some of the other factors that the United States put forward in the Libya case, which again, I think I can speak for all of us that no one's going to say that that held water at the time, but certainly there are some differences here, right? So the administration is not acting under a UN Security Council resolution. There's certainly no kind of legitimacy argument, right, underpinning its continuing use of force. In fact, the Article 2 rationale here would have to be that the president has the authority under Article 2 to commit murder, to engage in a campaign of extrajudicial killings. We also have this kind of the very idea with the word of hostilities, right? And Brian has unpacked this, including in a recent Just Security article, that Congress intended for hostilities to be broader than armed conflict. There's legislative history to that effect. Congress wanted to encompass these circumstances where there wasn't yet a confrontation, where no shots had been fired. All right, the executive branch has turned that on its head over time. This wouldn't be the first administration to do that. But certainly, as you said, Beck, it is just absolutely striking here that the administration isn't saying, oh, well, it was a one-off strike, it started and stopped, or they're not saying, oh, we've pulled back and we're no longer engaged in the kind of hostilities that would trigger the need to report. What they're saying here is we're in an armed conflict. They're saying we've suffered an armed attack, giving us the right to respond under Article 51 of the UN Charter. They said that to the Security Council and to Congress, right? They're saying the hostilities, right, include the drug trafficking and the fentanyl-related deaths that continue to occur, right? So none of this within kind of their own theory holds water, and I would say it's even one stretch farther than Libya in a number of those ways.
Yeah, but a thought here, observation. The argument for the administration is that these strikes in the Caribbean aren't hostilities because they're standoff strikes and U.S. forces are not exposed to risk. Okay. Well, that is inconsistent not only with the past practice of the executive branch in reporting, and I would direct listeners to the War Powers Reporting Project, which catalogs dozens of reports that are treated as hostilities across administrations of both parties, sort of standoff strikes, including in the first Trump administration. So like the 2017 and 2018 strikes on Syria were standoff strikes with minimal risk to U.S. forces. But those were reported as hostilities and regarded as such, implicating the War Powers Resolution. The other thing is to drill down a bit more on the legislative history. The specific context in which the War Powers Resolution was enacted, or Nixon's veto, was the bombing campaign in 1973 of Cambodia. Now, ground operations had largely ceased in Southeast Asia, but Operation Freedom Deal, which is a bombing campaign that was taking place across the spring and summer of Cambodia, was very much ongoing. And there was a big fight between Congress and the White House over that. And Congress passed a complete funding cutoff for those operations in an appropriations bill that the White House then vetoed, and looked like there was heading to a potential government shutdown over it. There was eventually a compromise negotiated, but in subsequent legislation, funding restrictions enacted by Congress that bracketed the enactment of the War Powers Resolution, Congress barred any funds from being used for, quote, hostilities in Cambodia. And so very much on Congress's mind was this notion that airstrikes constitute hostilities, and airstrikes were the sort of thing they were trying to include within the concept of hostilities.
So the 60-day clock having passed, what do we see out of Congress is kind of the question that I think is on a lot of our minds. What are they going to do about it, essentially? And I think that brings us to a broader topic of accountability and redress. I think there's the immediate term bucket of, is Congress or anyone else going to be able to stop this campaign from continuing? And second, will there be any accountability for it? I think we'd be remiss not to just briefly note that there have been international reactions that in normal times might be seen to move the needle, right? Where you have very close allies like Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, France, right, coming forward and either saying this is unlawful or suspending intelligence sharing, which clearly, reading between the lines would be because they think the intelligence is being used in unlawful ways. You have reactions from other states as well, China, Venezuela, Colombia, et cetera, right? Very making plain their view that this is unlawful, as well as reports coming out of the United Nations, right? Special rapporteurs and the like. But when we get to what's happening here, it's harder to see a path for accountability at present. And it's hard to see Congress taking really meaningful steps that would rein this in. But recent developments have potentially started to move that needle as well. And here I'm talking about revelations that it appears Defense Secretary Hegseth may have ordered a second strike after the first unlawful September 2nd strike that reportedly killed 11 members of TDA, as the administration has reported. It appears that 9 of those people were killed with a first strike, that there were 2 survivors clinging to the wreckage of their stricken vessel, and that an order was relayed down the chain of command to kill those 2 survivors. Now, this is all reporting that's very recent, and the administration itself is essentially simply denying the claim at present. But I do think this raises the question of, will we see a shift on the Hill or otherwise, right, based on this most recent reporting about what appears to be the purposeful targeting of survivors? So I don't know if Beck or Brian, you want to start with kind of this issue of why was that order manifestly unlawful, and what does it mean right here that it may have been carried out anyway, and kind of what are the reactions that we're seeing to that revelation?
Yeah, this I think is a really important development, and I think it might, people might fairly wonder, well, you've been saying that these strikes are murder all along. So what's really different about this particular action? And I think, as probably is evident to anyone who's been listening all along to this podcast, the explanation for why these strikes are murder is in some respects a little bit complicated. We've been talking about why these particular groups are not organized armed groups. We've talked about the fact that they have not attacked the United States. We've talked about the fact that we're not in an armed conflict with these groups. And we've talked about the fact that the people on these boats are neither combatants, even if we were in an armed conflict, nor are they DPHing. They're not directly participating in hostilities. But many of those decisions, the decision at the macro level to decide to use force against a particular group, that decision is often made at a very high level in an interagency process led by the National Security Council, that is not necessarily the kind of question that soldiers and sailors at the operational level necessarily have perfect insight into. And in this case, we know that that process is being fed essentially false facts from the White House that the OLC lawyers are relying on in providing their legal analysis. And so at the very high level, the macro decisions are most of, I won't say all, but there are a lot of what makes these particular strikes unlawful and what makes them manifestly murder to us, to experts who are watching this process and who have frankly participated in those NSC-led lawyers group processes many times over the decades. So this strike over the weekend is a little bit different. It is a classic textbook case example of a violation of one of the most basic long-standing principles of the law of armed conflict, the law governing the conduct of hostilities. And that is the prohibition on killing individuals who are hors de combat, killing individuals who are, in this case, shipwrecked. Now, all of this law only applies if we're in an armed conflict.
Right.
If we're not in an armed conflict, it's simply murder. It's murder to kill the person, whether they're on the boat or whether they're, frankly, clinging to the debris in the water beside the boat. But given that the individuals who are being asked to take these strikes are being told that this is an armed conflict and they are relying on the argument that this is an armed conflict, the second strike, the strike that is aimed at the person who is clearly, manifestly hors de combat, who is manifestly clinging to debris, is patently unlawful in a way that there can be no argument in favor. And I also think that it is highly unlikely that that OLC memo, whatever it says, would cover that particular activity. And so I think there is a good chance that that while it is highly unlikely that we see prosecutions of the boat strikes themselves, and it's highly unlikely that we see criminal accountability for the actions that are happening at the sort of administration level to use force against these boats, that might be different for this particular strike and any strikes like it, where an order is being given, a no quarter order is being given in order that there be no survivors, or the action is being taken to target and kill survivors. And if that goes all the way up to the Secretary of Defense, then that could potentially mean a risk of prosecution for Hegseth himself. And so that, I think, distinguishes it. And I think there's also a distinction politically. For whatever reason, this particular act is breaking through. We've got some Republicans on the Hill who are calling for investigations, both on the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. We've got the president himself disavowing the act. And I think that for me, the analog I'm seeing here is to the Abu Ghraib example from the post 9/11 years, when we had an administration authorizing and insisting upon what they called enhanced interrogation techniques, which we know now were torture of detainees. And we had we had several OLC memoranda purporting to justify those acts. And we saw no accountability at the highest levels for that action. But what we did see, and what broke through, I think, to the public as well, is that when individual soldiers engaged in rogue acts of abuse of detainees and took pictures of it, and these were pictures of people wearing hoods, wires coming off of their limbs, dogs being sicked on them, and soldiers smiling next to them, that broke through both to the public imagination and ultimately that they were those individuals were prosecuted and court-martialed for that behavior. And so I see that as a possible analog. The big difference being here we have the command possibly coming. And I say possibly because I think there's a difference. There's a factual question here, and Hegseth himself is denying it, but the command is possibly coming from the Secretary of Defense himself. And there may be several people who witnessed this and can testify to it.
Right. We should note that there are essentially two orders within the chain of command that are at issue here. And Mike Schmidt, Ryan Goodman, and I wrote about this in a piece published this morning. But the Washington Post reporting and CNN reporting that breaks this story is saying, on September 2nd, there was an order from Secretary Hegseth to kill everybody. And that implicates, of course, the denial of quarter that you mentioned, patently unlawful for that reason, if it is as reported. But then we also have, as the Washington Post has said, this second order conveyed by Admiral Mitch Bradley, the special operations commander overseeing the attack, to strike the two men who were known to be surviving from that first attack, which obviously implicates the example, the rule that you were mentioning, Beck, that individuals who are ordered to combat, that is, who are defenseless, cannot be targeted. And in fact, the prime example, the only example given in the text of the DoD Law of War Manual for a clearly illegal order is an order to fire upon the shipwrecked, which quote, would be clearly illegal. So those two orders are both at issue. And we obviously need to get to the bottom of what each of them understood themselves to be conveying, what was actually conveyed, and what was followed up on from that. But certainly from what's been reported to date, it would appear that both orders are manifestly unlawful. And therefore, those in the chain of command below each of these individuals, right below Hegseth, below Bradley, would have had a duty not to follow those orders.
And can you talk about what that looks like for those that are below the top of the chain of command in that moment, and how, Beck, I think you've previously spoken about the necessity to really focus on leadership because of the impossible situation that those further down the chain might be in. And I agree with Tess that by the time this podcast airs, perhaps we'll have more information about the factual circumstances of who gave what order. But we know that there was a more senior, or it has been reported that there was a more senior order that came. And we have folks that have to actually, figuratively pull the trigger. So what are the choices that they actually face? And what can, to take the next step out, what can those in Congress do to unpack that chain of command and learn more for themselves and for the public?
Well, I just want to clarify that when I said previously that it might be that these individuals were in an unfair situation, and they are, the soldiers and sailors at the operational level, and that we shouldn't be focusing on them. That was in the context of the sort of broader, the broader strikes. I think in the context of a no quarter order, in the context of an order to kill survivors, to kill the shipwrecked, this is the kind of thing that could have been a PowerPoint slide in your basic ops law course that every soldier would have taken. There's a reason we train soldiers in basic IHL, and there's a reason the Geneva Convention's required of states. And this is because these individuals can and should be held accountable for even following manifestly unlawful orders. And this one, I think, is manifestly unlawful. And so I think anyone in the chain of command who ordered or sent that order down the chain can and should be held accountable for it.
Yep. I think that it really brings into focus for a lot of people who've been kind of willing to go along with the campaign as a whole, the patent illegality of this particular order can bring it into sharper focus, even though we of course shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there should also be accountability for those who've ordered the broader campaign, which itself is clearly unlawful, no matter what is in that OLC memo that we haven't seen yet. Transitioning maybe to one final set of developments, there's continued to be not just saber rattling pointed towards Venezuela, but even, say, tweets from the president himself stating that the airspace over Venezuela was closed. Reportedly, a phone call between President Trump and Maduro last week took place. Brian, I'm wondering if you can just shed a little light on what is going on with Venezuela and whether there is an international armed conflict on the horizon, which of course would be separate from what we've been seeing so far, which are non-international armed conflicts with non-state armed groups, and kind of what the state of play is as between Washington and Caracas.
Sure. So I think it's important to realize at the outset that this killing spree at sea, particularly in the Caribbean, is also part of the broader pressure campaign by the administration against Nicolas Maduro, a campaign being orchestrated by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, with the goal of coercing Maduro into stepping down or emboldening those around him to topple him. Now, the president of the United States has not yet made a decision on actually whether to use military force. And the saber rattling we've seen in the Caribbean, this no-fly zone declared via presidential tweet, the revelations of supposed new CIA covert action authorities, the military posturing of B-52s flying off the coast of Venezuela, and the recent designation of the so-called Cartel de los Soles, a cartel that doesn't actually exist, but is alleged to be comprised of senior Venezuelan military officers and headed by Maduro himself, the designation of this non-existent entity as a terrorist organization. All of this is designed to coerce Maduro, maybe not in Trump's perspective, with the goal of regime change being the ultimate objective, maybe to wring additional concessions out of him in some negotiation. But the administration is engaged in a lot of threats of the use of force, but which in themselves violate Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. And obviously, any attack on Venezuela itself would violate Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, and there's no congressional authorization for that. But there has been attempts, bipartisan attempts, to block military action through a resolution in the Senate. Senator Kaine has indicated he's going to introduce another resolution to block military action against Venezuela. And the president is reportedly meeting with his national security team today in the Oval Office to discuss Venezuela. So the authorization for such or presidential directive for such unauthorized and unlawful attack could come at any time.
And is the legal reasoning that's been deployed to date that relates to what has been claimed to be a non-international armed conflict at all relevant to those actions if they were taken, or would the administration need to advance different theories, and could they be consistent?
In legal reality land, no. The attack on Venezuela, attack on the Venezuelan government would be an international armed conflict to be governed by the Geneva Conventions, in addition to violating Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. I do think it's notable here, however, that the administration has taken the position that standoff strikes that don't implicate or risk U.S. personnel don't constitute hostilities for war powers purposes, because that gives them a huge loophole to potentially conduct tomahawk strikes or long-range or bomber strikes with cruise missiles against Venezuela, and do so without regard to the limitations imposed by the War Powers Resolution. So that I find concerning. And more generally, I think it's worth noting that the administration is using this rhetoric about terrorism, the labeling of the so-called Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization, to rhetorically and politically pave the way for potential military action.
Interesting, though. Again, there's a tension between the arguments they're making about the boat strikes, right, and the arguments they might presumably be making about the Maduro government and Venezuela itself. If their arguments in the AEA cases, if they're arguing that Maduro is sending these organizations, right, to commit acts of violence, again, made up facts, in the United States, that is at odds with the argument that these are entirely non-state actors with whom we're in an IAC. If the argument is that Maduro is sending them, then are our strikes on the boats strikes on intended to be perceived as strikes on Venezuela already?
And just as a last question on this, a little bit more broadly, Brian, you've written eloquently about this recently, and there was another piece in Just Security just today by Mark Nevitt about the sort of broader consequences of the precedents that the administration is setting in these actions and in its legal reasoning. So maybe just really briefly, if you could each speak to that.
Well, I mean, when you boil it down, what is happening here is the administration is asserting a license to kill outside the law, notwithstanding whatever legal mumbo jumbo is in this OLC opinion. And they've tethered that to the president's prior determination that somebody is, quote, a terrorist, right, based solely on his own say-so. Now, that's a term that the administration not just used to people on these boats. They've also referred to Nicolas Maduro as a terrorist and domestic political opponents, okay? And so what are the limits, if any, on this license to kill, okay? And so what we see here is that the administration is able to get lawyers to sign off on things that strike us as, patently unlawful, okay? And people will implement those orders. And so where does that stop? And that's one of the major concerns about what we're seeing in this killing spree at sea, okay? So first they come for the supposed drug traffickers, but who next?
Well, I think that's an important point, and maybe one that we should wrap on, Brian, that what is at bottom being asserted here is the power to kill outside of the law. This reporting over Thanksgiving weekend about a September 2nd strike targeting survivors, I think, is clarifying this in the mind of some because it is so egregiously unlawful, but should be understood as a wake-up call about the campaign as a whole. And that's something that, of course, we've been talking about since the beginning of this podcast series, and we'll be here to break down the next developments that occur in the weeks to come. So thanks to all of you for shedding light on what's going on in the campaign, what's going on in Congress, what's going on more broadly in the world, and how we should understand the relevance and the importance of these strikes for the rule of law, for the strategic direction of this country, and for whether the United States can continue to have a professional military that we rely on to act as a responsible actor in the world. And with that, this episode was co-hosted by me, Tess Bridgeman, and Rachel Goldbrenner, and cross-posted by Just Security and the Reiss Center on Law and Security at NYU School of Law. It was produced by Maya Neer with help from Isaac Rubenstein. A special thanks to both of our guests, Rebecca Ingber and Brian Finucane, for joining us again today. You can listen to installments 1, 2, and 3 of Murder on the High Seas wherever you get your podcasts, or watch them on Just Security's YouTube channel. This episode is also part of Just Security's collection, U.S. Lethal Strikes on Suspected Drug Traffickers, linked in this episode's show notes.
And for a comprehensive open source and living resource on war powers, please check out the show notes for a link to the War Powers Resolution Reporting Project at NYU Law's Reiss Center on Law and Security. And of course, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.